Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Today we're going to take a look at Witness from Istari Games, which I will tell you right now, and I'm not going to say whether the game is good or bad until we get to my final thoughts section, but I will say now that it is one of the most interesting games I have ever played. It's based off of the Blake and Mortimer comic series from Belgium, which I had never heard of before, but I looked into it before I wanted to do the review, and it's pretty interesting. It's like an older version of Johnny Quest in the sense that instead of a bunch of kids going on these sort of pulp adventures, it's this scientist and his MI5 agent buddy, Blake and Mortimer, who have detective adventures, sometimes more in the realm of Sherlock Holmes, but sometimes treading the line between science fiction and fantasy and time travel, things like that. And they just have these wacky adventures. They meet a bunch of interesting people along the way. And I think that the primary comic was based in the late 40s, but then other iterations of the comic were in the 50s and 60s. So I dig it. I dig the style of that. But that's getting into the review section a bit. What is Witness? It is a game of elaborate telephone, essentially. You and the other players are working cooperatively to go through an investigation and figure out as many clues successfully as possible in order to have the best sort of win ratio with the investigation to solve as much of the crime as you possibly can. Sometimes it's not a crime, sometimes it's just trying to find out information about, let's say, secret agents at a party, trying to identify them, or sometimes it is just solving a murder. But you and the other players have to whisper to each other at the table. You actually have to, everyone has their own clue, they whisper it to someone else, and it keeps going around with the clues compiling until you get to the end, and you have to remember as much as you can in order to get as much information down on paper as you can, and hopefully all of you combine your answers and come to a solution for the crime or incident or whatever it might be. It's kind of hard to describe, and I don't know how this overview is going to go because it's even a difficult game to explain in an overview, but I will give it my best shot, and then we're going to come back, and I'll let you know what I think. Alright, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of Witness. This is a game for exactly 4 players. And by the way, I forgot to mention this during my outro, which I filmed before I filmed this, but it is a significant thing to note that you need exactly 4 players for this game, no more, no less. So please bear that in mind before you consider purchasing it, because I know that can be tough for some game groups. Witness is an interesting cooperative game where players are working together to solve mysteries, and it might be a murder, or it just might be trying to figure out the identities of people at a party. There's a lot of different scenarios, or cases, in fact, is what they're called. So you have a case book here, and here are all the different cases that you have to work with. There's 64 of them for you to go through, and they're color-coded by difficulty. I don't want to talk about too many of them because I don't want to give spoilers, so we're basically just going to talk about the Blood on the Snow, which was the first introductory one, and the one that you should start off with. So you'll have the case book. You should all decide collectively which scenario or which case you're going to do. You have the solution book and the question book, but those are not going to be used until the end of each game of Witness. And each game of Witness is relatively quick. I just knocked over the LOM. Each game of Witness is pretty quick, and so you can play several games consecutively. Most likely that's how we did it. The yellow M is one of the characters from the Blake and Mortimer comics, and I think he shows up in some of the later scenarios, or not scenarios that I played, but for most of the game, you're just going to use him as a player piece to keep track of the rounds of play. This here is the whisper board, and there's 2 whisper boards that come with the game, and they're both double-sided. This just tells you how you're going to be whispering to each other, because that is what the whole mechanism of this game is. You are whispering clues to your neighbors. You should try and be seated just like this, where each character in their books are next to each other in a certain way. Mortimer, Blake, Nazir, and LaBruce, although it doesn't have to be that way, I suppose, but that's really how the boards are set up. And the board is going to tell you which way you should be whispering to each other each round. So, for instance, on this board, in round 1, Mortimer is first going to whisper to Blake, and Nazir is going to whisper to LaBruce, but then the next round it's going to be LaBruce to Mortimer, and Blake to Nazir, and other boards might change that. Speaking of which, each player is going to have a few components. They're going to have a standee whose only purpose is to remind the other players who they are, which is actually more important than you would think. It just helps the game run smoother. Everyone's going to have their own character book, and these link up with the case book, meaning that let's say that you're choosing to do case 1, Blood on the Snow, then you would just go to the very first page, the Blood on the Snow page, and that is the only page that you need to worry about for that case. And it goes all the way up to, of course, 64, and that's how everyone's books are set up. So you'll have your own book to go through. You can always reference it at any point during the game. The pens do not come with the game, by the way. You are going to need some sort of pen or pencil to keep track of things, and every player is going to get one of these little note sheets. You'll have at the top, you can write the name of the case, and then any notes at a certain point in the game, not in the beginning, at the end of each game, you can start taking notes, and then there are questions that you'll have to answer. And that is the goal of the game, which I guess I should have stated sooner. You are trying to answer questions about the investigation which you are about to undertake. And the whole point of whispering clues to each other is to try to all be on the same page, literally and metaphorically, in order to get the most information and for everyone to answer 3 questions that are in the question book at the end of the game successfully. And if you're able to do so, then you may potentially, well, you're not really winning the game, but you're trying to get as high a score as possible. Because there are 4 players and 3 questions, the highest score you can get is 12 points. Anything less than that, and you're not quite a stellar investigator. So this is a bit awkward because there's not really a way for me to show you how the whispering mechanism of the game works. You literally have to lean into the person that you're supposed to lean into based on the board and whisper your clue to them. So let's take a look at Mortimer's book here. And again, this is just the first scenario, so I hope no one's going to feel too spoiled by it. But if you don't want to, I would just skip ahead to my final thoughts at this point. You probably have enough of a gist of it. But here on the Blood in the Snow page, in the text box, now the red text here is actually just for to sort of help you since this is your first scenario. You can just kind of ignore that if you want. The main thing here is the green text box here. Every player is going to have a similar page to this, although it might have extra stuff on it depending on the case, of course. And this is your clue. This is the important part for you. You'll always have some sort of illustration alongside it to help you along. The goal of it, first you would, I suppose I've skipped a bit ahead. You'll look at the case and it'll have a flavor text box here telling you the story, which you can read. And this is all about a murder that took place with several different individuals involved. And you and the other investigators have found out some clues about it. And now you have to disperse that information amongst the other people in the group because you were not all at the same place at the same time. So Mortimer here says, I was intrigued by the man named Paul, a rich local farmer. His footprints in the snow looked like this. Now, what will often happen in these clues is that some of the important points will be highlighted. So in this case, the important points are that Paul, his footprints had, the bottom soles of his shoes had these 6 dots, these like 6 circular indentations. That is the important thing that you can glean out of this information. But sometimes you never know. Sometimes stuff that might not seem that important becomes all important, and sometimes it helps you in giving your clue. Because when you give your clue, for the very first round of play, all you need to do is make sure that you give your clue successfully. That's the most important part. And you can give your clue as highly detailed or as little detail as you want, whatever you can do to help you remember. You might say specifically word for word what's in there, but that's going to get harder over time because when you get to round 2, now whoever the 2 players are that are whispering have to give their clue and the clues that they heard on the previous round. Then, same thing for round 3. Now it's back to the first 2 whisperers. Those people have to give all 3 clues that they have gleaned so far. Their clue, the first clue that they've heard, and then the next clue that they've heard. And then, round 4, you're giving every clue to your partner that you're whispering to. So it gets more and more difficult to keep track of all these different clues and all this different information, but you need to do that because every player needs to be on the same page for when you get to the final round. And the final round is when you go to the question book, look in the question book at the appropriate page, and everything is very simple. Everything's on on one page in the book, so it's easy to reference. You go to the Blood on the Snow page, and it will give you a sort of picture in a lot of instances that all the players can refer to, along with some story boxes, and then the questions that you need to answer. So, was there a witness to the crime? If so, who? Who performed this horrible homicide, and what do you think happened to the body? And other players have been giving you clues about what the images on the soles of the feet, one of the characters is like the town fool, all these different things, and now you can refer to the picture and try to figure out and piece together all the clues and figure out who the murderers are, who is involved, who got killed, what happened to the body, all these different things. If everyone can answer the question accurately, you'll get the maximum score of 12 points. This very rarely happens. More likely you'll get less points than that, but it's all about just trying to work cooperatively and do your best. Hopefully that gets across some of these strange gameplay elements of Witness appropriately enough. Let's go ahead and get to my final thoughts. The theme of Witness is, of course, all important. In a game like this, where you're just reading stories from a book, and each player has their own little bits of flavor text and these thematic clues that they have to give towards the adventure, theme is all important, and it would make or break the game. And here I think it works very well. It's a deduction mystery styled game, so of course having this Blake and Mortimer comic series all about solving mysteries, some of them very outlandish, just fits perfectly here, and it works really, really well. Component-wise, because you have nothing but books essentially in the game, and then some player standees, and of course the turn order board, or the whisper order board, that is probably going to leave some players wanting more, because it makes it seem like less of a game and more of an activity, which I'll get back to and touch on again in a second. But everything looks really good. I like the artwork, I like the design, everything is very clear cut. The rule books is super easy and very simple because it's not a very complicated game. So all of the physical stuff in the game is laid out pretty well. I can imagine that if you play this game a lot over a long period of time, those books are going to get pretty worn down. So maybe they'll come out with a digital version of it eventually if the game takes off. And I would hope so, because I really, really like this game. But I do want to stress, and I just mentioned this a second ago, there can be an argument made that this is much more of an activity than a game. And I do rail against some games like that at times, but the saving grace here is that there is a definite structure and rule set to the game, a framework that you're working within, while at the same time you are working cooperatively and in a very, very interesting and fascinating way that is much, much more based on the mind and perception and memory retention abilities of the players than most games that I've played before. There's a lot of Euro games or even other deduction games that, yeah, maybe they rely on memory, but you can sort of follow clues and follow these breadcrumb trails and sort of just look at the evidence out there in front of you. If you're talking about like a really heavy Euro game, you can just see the board and see where everything is. Here, it's strictly remembering what people told to you and then relaying that information in a way that you know that the other players are going to be able to maintain as well, because not everyone at the table is going to be at the same speed as far as memory. But if you can say it in a good way, that might not matter. And to me, that is fascinating. For others, I can anticipate that will not be enough game for them, but I really, really enjoyed it. It's so fascinating, that whole aspect of, okay, it starts off very simple. You just got to give one clue, and maybe it's very simple. And when I first started playing the game with a couple of different groups, it was people trying to verbatim rattle off what the first clue was. That flies out the window very quickly when you realize the sheer amount of information that you eventually have to be passing along. So suddenly you're getting down to just a few words per clue, like the Daniel's shoes star, because that's the best way that you could possibly get this information across. It's information overload. So that's part of the strategy of the game, is getting these clues across, while at the same time knowing you have to give every clue that you possibly can, or there's no chance you will ever win the game. And it's tricky, and the game gets easier as you go along and play it more and more, because you need to get everyone on the same page as to the rhythm of the game. But once you do, it's a beautiful thing. People know what to do. They grab their booklet, they go to the page, they give the clues. It feels very swift, very smooth, and I really enjoy that aspect of it. The one thing I'll say, in addition to it being more of an activity than a game in some ways, is the fact that it's also stressful. And I was thinking of Hanabi a lot while we were playing this game. And Hanabi has some memory elements, but otherwise it's a very different game, except for the fact that
I recall a lot that when I was playing Hanabi with different members of my group, they all essentially said the same thing to me. I mean, there's some people in my group that, like me, just love Hanabi and will play it whenever. But a lot of people would say, look, Hanabi is a fine game. It's a very well-designed game. It could even be a great game, but I will never play it again because it is too stressful for me. It is too stressful not only to remember things, but also to know that the rest of the group is relying on me to retain this information and then use it in a beneficial way. And a lot of that goes on in Witness as well, to the point where people that I played with were like, wow, this game is just like, it's stressful. It feels like work in some ways. And I also rail against games that I think feel like a chore or feel like work, but Witness just manages to do it in such a clever way, such a straightforward way, that I really enjoyed it. There's so many adventures. Now, that could obviously be a criticism of the game as well, is that once you've played an adventure, it's done. You've used it up. But there are so many adventures in the game that I can easily see that if you got to the end of it, you would be like, wow, what were the clues in the first adventure again? I don't even remember. So I can easily see that being the case. And I know that seems odd since the whole point of the game is memory, but I haven't obviously tested this theory. I haven't even gotten into the mid-level difficulty adventures yet, but I would imagine that you would be able to replay these after some amount of time has passed. And I'm sure that if the game maintains some popularity, that there will be more expansion booklets to be had as well. And by the way, going back to that thing with the difficulty, I am terrified of getting to the mid-level and upper-level difficulties because the base game, the beginner version adventures, are so hard. And it did get easier over time, but man, this game is difficult. So that goes hand in hand with that stress that I was talking about. But for me, it's a good kind of stress. I like the theme. I like the kitschy pulp adventures of these secret agents. It's done in like a serious way, but in sometimes sort of a comical way. And I love the narration that goes on throughout the book. And I just think that this is a wonderful, more importantly, unique experience. Something I haven't really experienced that much of, and it is definitely staying in my collection, and I can't wait to play it again. That is Witness from Istari Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.